I found the ribbon on a Tuesday, tucked into the inner pocket of my husband's traveling coat. And in that moment I understood that some secrets are kept not out of cruelty, but out of a love so consuming it can never be spoken aloud. The pale pink silk was no larger than my palm, frayed at the edges and still faintly scented with lavender, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the man I had married 3 years before. The morning had begun, as all mornings did at Thornfield Hall. I woke alone in my chambers, the autumn light filtering through heavy damask curtains in shades of amber and gray. My maid, sweet young Margaret, had already drawn the drapes and laid out my day dress, a modest creation in dove-gray wool that matched the perpetual mood of this house. I could hear the distant sounds of the household stirring to life, the soft footfalls of servants in the corridors below, the rattle of china as breakfast was prepared in the vast kitchens I had visited only twice in 3 years of residence. I dressed without enthusiasm, my fingers moving through the familiar rituals of lacing and buttoning with the automatic precision of a woman who has learned to occupy her time with small, meaningless tasks. Margaret helped me arrange my dark hair into a simple chignon, her young face reflected beside mine in the mirror, and I wondered if she could see what I had become. A ghost in a grand house, a wife in name only. A duchess who moved through marbled halls like a portrait come to life, beautiful and silent and utterly without purpose. Edward had left for London 4 days earlier. He had informed me of his departure over breakfast, his voice polite and distant as always, explaining something about business with his solicitors and meetings that could not be delayed. I had nodded, sipped my tea, and watched him leave without emotion. This was our arrangement, after all. He had married me to restore my family's failing fortune and save my younger sisters from destitution. I had married him to fulfill my duty. Love had never been part of the negotiation. But that morning, as Margaret helped me into my day dress, Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, appeared at my door with an unusual request. The master's traveling coat had been returned from the carriage house with mud along the hem, she explained, and she wondered if I might inspect it before sending it to be cleaned. There was a tear in the lining that needed mending, and she thought perhaps I would wish to see if anything had fallen from the pockets. It was an odd request. Mrs. Holloway had managed this household for 30 years and knew far better than I did what needed doing. But I had learned in my 3 years at Thornfield that the servants sometimes sought me out for small matters as a way of showing respect, of acknowledging that I was, nominally at least, the mistress of this domain. So I followed her down the back stairs to the small room where outdoor garments were kept and brushed and mended. The coat lay across a wooden table, dark wool still damp from the rain that had fallen the night Edward departed. Mrs. Holloway showed me the tear in the silk lining, a clean rip near the inner pocket, and then she left me alone, saying she would fetch her sewing basket. I stood there in the quiet room, surrounded by the smell of wet wool and leather, and felt an unexpected impulse to touch something that belonged to my husband. I had so few opportunities to know him. He was courteous but never warm, present but never truly there. In 3 years of marriage, he had come to my bed exactly 7 times, always in darkness, always in silence. He had never hurt me, but he had never held me afterward either. He would rise, dress, and return to his own chambers without a word, leaving me to wonder if I had failed at some essential wifely duty I did not understand. My fingers moved to the pockets of the coat, almost without thought. The outer pockets held nothing but a pair of worn leather gloves and a folded handkerchief. But when I reached into the inner pocket, the one with the torn lining, my hand closed around something small and soft. I drew it out into the pale morning light and felt my breath catch. A ribbon. Pink silk, faded to the color of wild roses, narrow and delicate. The kind a mother might tie in a baby's hair or around a christening gown. It had been handled often, I could tell, the edges worn thin and the fabric creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. And when I lifted it to my nose, I caught the faintest ghost of lavender, the scent ladies use to freshen their wardrobes and protect their finest things from moths. I stood there for what felt like hours, but could only have been moments, turning the ribbon over in my hands, my mind racing with questions I had no way to answer. Why would Edward carry such a thing? Why would he keep it hidden in the lining of his traveling coat in a place where it might easily be lost? And whose child had worn this ribbon once upon a time? Mrs. Holloway returned with her sewing basket and found me standing frozen, the ribbon clutched in my palm. She stopped in the doorway, and I saw something flicker across her weathered face. Recognition, perhaps. Or was it pity? "Tell me," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. "Tell me what this means." She set down her basket slowly, her eyes never leaving the ribbon. "My lady," she said, and there was a heaviness to her words that made my stomach tighten. "That is not my story to tell." "But you know," I said, "you know what this is." She pressed her lips together, and for a moment I thought she would refuse to answer. Then she sighed, a sound weighted with years of kept secrets. "There was a young woman once," she said softly, "before you came to Thornfield, a governess to the children of a neighboring estate. The master was very young, barely 21. It was before his father had arranged his marriage to you." I felt something crack inside my chest, a fissure opening in the careful composure I had maintained for 3 years. "A governess," I repeated. Mrs. Holloway nodded. She was gentle and kind by all accounts. They met at a country assembly, and he fell quite desperately in love with her. But the old Duke would hear nothing of it. She had no fortune, no family name. She was entirely unsuitable. "What happened to her?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer. "She died," Mrs. Holloway said quietly, "in childbed. The babe lived, but the mother did not survive the night." The room seemed to tilt around me. I reached out to steady myself against the table, the ribbon still warm in my hand. "A child," I whispered. "Edward has a child." Mrs. Holloway looked away. "That is not my story to tell, my lady. I have already said more than I should." She took the coat then, her movements brisk and efficient, and left me standing there alone, with the weight of this revelation pressing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. I walked back to my chambers in a daze, climbing the stairs without seeing them, moving through corridors that suddenly felt like the passages of a stranger's home. In my sitting room, I sank into the chair by the window and stared out at the gray autumn sky. Rain had begun to fall again, soft and steady, turning the formal gardens into a watercolor of fading greens and browns. I thought of Edward's face, the way sadness lived in the corners of his eyes, even when he smiled his polite, distant smile. I thought of the way he sometimes stood at his study window late into the night, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring out at nothing I could name. I had thought he was simply cold, a man shaped by duty and propriety who had no room in his heart for affection. But perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps he had loved once, deeply and completely, and lost everything. Perhaps the distance I felt between us was not indifference at all, but the careful preservation of a heart too damaged to risk breaking again. And there was a child. Somewhere, a little girl or boy who carried Edward's blood hidden away like a shameful secret. The thought made me ache in ways I did not fully understand. I had no children of my own. Edward's visits to my bed had been too infrequent and too perfunctory to result in conception, and I had begun to accept that I would never be a mother. But to think that he had a child already, living somewhere beyond these walls, unknown and unacknowledged, filled me with a grief that was not entirely for myself. I was still sitting there, the ribbon clutched in my hand, when Margaret came to tell me that luncheon was ready. I had no appetite, but I went downstairs anyway, moving through the motions of my daily life because I did not know what else to do. I ate alone in the vast dining room, surrounded by portraits of Blackmore ancestors who stared down at me with expressions of stern disapproval. They seemed to know I did not belong here, that I was an outsider who had bought her way into this ancient family with her father's desperation and her own willingness to be bartered like livestock. After luncheon, I retreated to the library, seeking comfort in the familiar routine of reading. But the words swam before my eyes and I could not concentrate. I kept thinking of that ribbon, of the careful way it had been folded and hidden, of the lavender scent that spoke of tenderness and memory. Edward had kept this token close, had carried it with him even on his journey to London. Whatever had happened with this governess, whoever this child was, it mattered to him still. The afternoon passed slowly. I tried to occupy myself with correspondence, with a bit of embroidery, with anything that might distract me from the questions circling in my mind like restless birds. But everything felt hollow, pointless. I had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible, of asking no questions and disturbing no peace. And now I held in my hand proof that my husband's life contained depths I had never imagined, sorrows I had never been allowed to share. Evening came, and with it a change in the weather. The soft rain gave way to wind, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the terrace. I dressed for dinner in a gown of deep blue silk, knowing I would eat alone again, but maintaining the proprieties because that was what a duchess did. I descended to the dining room precisely at 7, as I always did, and found the table set for 1, as it always was. But tonight there was a difference. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway just as I was finishing my soup, her face drawn and pale. "My lady," she said, her voice tight. "A messenger has just arrived from Ravenswood. The old Duke is dead." I set down my spoon carefully, my hands suddenly cold. Edward's father, the man who had arranged our marriage, who had chosen me from a list of suitable candidates like one might select a horse at auction. I had met him only 3 times at our wedding and twice afterward at formal dinners, where he had regarded me with cold assessment and found me adequate but unremarkable. "When did it happen?" I asked. "Yesterday morning," Mrs. Holloway said. "A seizure, they believe. He was found in his study." I nodded slowly, my mind already racing ahead to what this would mean. Edward would have to return from London immediately. There would be a funeral to arrange, mourners to receive, the reading of the will. The old Duke had been a man of vast holdings and rigid control. His death would change everything. "Send word to London at once," I said. "The Duke must be informed." "A rider has already been dispatched, my lady. He should reach London by morning." I dismissed her with a nod and sat alone in the dining room, no longer able to pretend interest in food. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the house a door slammed shut. I thought of the ribbon upstairs in my chamber, where I had hidden it in my jewelry box like a guilty secret. And I thought of Edward, receiving the news of his father's death in some London townhouse, his face carefully composed, but his heart perhaps breaking in ways he would never show. I did not know what to feel. Grief seemed inappropriate for a man I had barely known, and who had treated me with polite indifference at best. But neither could I feel relief. Though the old Duke's presence had always been oppressive even when he was miles away, his expectations and judgments hanging over Thornfield like a dark cloud. What I felt, I realized, was fear. Fear of what would come next, of what secrets might be revealed, of how the careful balance of my marriage might shift in ways I could not predict or control. The ribbon had opened a door I could not close, and the old Duke's death felt like another door swinging wide, revealing shadows I was not certain I wished to see illuminated. That night I lay awake in my bed, listening to the storm rage outside my windows. I thought of Edward somewhere in London, perhaps also lying awake, perhaps mourning the father who had shaped his life with such an iron hand. I thought of the governess who had died giving birth to his child and wondered if she had known, in those final moments, that she would be remembered with such devotion. And I thought of the child, whoever and wherever they were, ignorant of the storm that was about to break over all of us. Sleep came eventually, thin and restless, filled with dreams of ribbons and rain and closed doors that would not stay shut. When I woke, gray dawn was breaking over the estate, and I knew with a certainty I could not explain that Edward would arrive today, that the careful distance we had maintained for 3 years was about to collapse, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. I rose and dressed, my movements mechanical, my heart beating too fast in my chest. Margaret brought my breakfast tray, but I could not eat. I stood instead at my window, watching the drive that curved through the parkland toward the main road, waiting for the sight of his carriage. He arrived just after noon, his coach pulling up to the front entrance with a spray of gravel. I watched from the upstairs window as he descended, his face pale and drawn, his movements stiff with exhaustion from the hasty journey. He wore black already, I noticed. He must have stopped somewhere to procure mourning clothes. I should have gone down to greet him, to offer my condolences, to play the role of the supportive wife. But my feet would not carry me toward the stairs. Instead, I stood frozen, watching as he entered the house below, hearing the murmur of voices as the servants received him. And still, I did not move. It was perhaps a quarter of an hour later when I heard his footsteps in the corridor outside my chamber. My heart leaped into my throat. In 3 years, Edward had never come to my rooms during daylight hours. Our interactions were confined to brief encounters at breakfast, occasional dinners when he was in residence, and those rare, silent visits to my bed that left me feeling more alone than I had before. The knock, when it came, was soft but firm. I opened the door to find him standing there, still in his traveling clothes, his dark hair disheveled from the wind. Our eyes met, and I saw something in his gaze I had never seen before. Not the polite distance I was accustomed to, but something raw and unguarded, as if the journey and the news and the exhaustion had stripped away his careful composure. "Eleanor," he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth than it ever had before. "We must talk." I stepped back to let him enter, my hands trembling slightly as I closed the door behind him. He stood in the center of my sitting room, this man who was my husband in name, but a stranger in every other sense, and for the first time since our wedding day, he looked truly vulnerable. The afternoon light fell across his face, illuminating the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the shadow of grief that darkened his features. "Please sit," I said, gesturing toward the chairs by the fireplace, though no fire had been lit. The words felt absurdly formal given the circumstances, but I did not know what else to say. He shook his head. "I would rather stand if you do not mind. What I have to tell you is not easily said sitting down." My heart began to beat faster. I moved to the window, needing some distance between us, needing the familiar view of the gardens to anchor me. "Very well," I said quietly. "Then speak." He was silent for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing, could sense the war being waged within him between duty and desire, between the need for secrecy and the burden of truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "My father is dead," he began. "You already know this. But what you do not know is what his death means, what it will reveal." I turned to face him, my hands clasped tightly together. "I found something," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "In your coat. A ribbon." His face went pale, then flushed, emotions chasing across his features too quickly for me to name them all. "You had no right," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only a terrible weariness. "Mrs. Holloway asked me to inspect the coat," I said. "There was a tear in the lining. The ribbon fell out." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, I saw something that made my chest ache. Resignation, perhaps, or relief, as if he had been carrying this secret for so long that its exposure, however unwanted, came almost as a mercy. "Then you know," he said, "or you have guessed." "I know there was a governess," I said carefully. "I know she died. I know there was a child." He turned away from me then, walking to the fireplace and bracing his hands against the mantel. His shoulders were rigid with tension, his head bowed. "Her name was Catherine," he said, so softly I had to strain to hear him. Catherine Webb. She was governess to the Hartley children at Willowbrook, the estate 5 miles east of here. I met her at a country assembly when I was 21. She was 23 and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I said nothing, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that any sound might stop this flow of confession. She was not beautiful in the way society defines it, he continued. Not like you, with your classical features and perfect deportment. Catherine was small and slight, with red hair that never stayed properly pinned and freckles across her nose. But when she smiled, Eleanor, when she smiled, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. She had this way of looking at the world with such joy, such curiosity, as if everything was an adventure waiting to unfold. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and I saw his hands tighten on the mantel. I wanted to go to him, to offer some comfort, but I did not know if he would welcome my touch. We had never touched except in the most perfunctory ways, the brief press of hands at our wedding, the cold formality of those 7 nights in my bed. We began meeting in secret, he said. She would slip away from Willowbrook on her half-days, and I would ride out to the old miller's cottage on the border of our lands. We would spend hours there, talking, laughing. She told me about the books she loved, about her childhood in Devon, about her dreams of someday having a school of her own where girls of all classes could learn. And I told her things I had never told another soul. About the weight of my father's expectations, about how trapped I felt by the life that had been planned for me before I was even born. I sat down slowly in one of the chairs, my legs suddenly unsteady. The man speaking was not the Edward I knew, the cold and distant Duke of Blackmore. This was someone else entirely, someone capable of passion and vulnerability, someone who had once dreamed of a different life. We loved each other, he said simply, completely and without reservation. I asked her to marry me after 3 months. I knew my father would never approve, that there would be consequences, but I did not care. I thought love was enough. I thought we could find a way. But your father found out, I said. He laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. He found out because I was fool enough to write to him, to try to explain, to ask for his blessing, even though I knew it would not be given. I thought if he met her, if he could see how good she was, how intelligent and kind, he might understand. Instead, he summoned me to Ravenswood and informed me that if I married Catherine Webb, I would be disinherited entirely. Every property, every penny, everything that was Blackmore would go to my cousin Richard upon my father's death. And Richard, he reminded me, was a gambler and a drunkard who would see the entire estate destroyed within 5 years. He turned to face me then, and the anguish in his eyes was so raw it was painful to witness. I was 21 years old, Eleanor. The tenants, the servants, the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on Blackmore, they meant nothing to my father compared to his precious family honor. But they meant something to me. How could I choose my own happiness over their survival? How could I condemn them all for the sake of love? You gave her up, I whispered. I told her we could not marry. I told her it was impossible. She wept, but she understood. Catherine always understood duty. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and one of the things that made losing her unbearable. She said she would leave Willowbrook, go back to Devon, try to forget me, and I tried to forget her. I threw myself into managing the estate, into being the son my father demanded I be. I stopped riding past Willowbrook. I stopped going to assemblies. I tried to kill whatever it was in me that had been capable of love. But you saw her again, I said, because I could see where this story was leading, could feel the tragedy unfolding, like the pages of a book I could not put down. He nodded slowly. 6 months later, she sent me a letter. She was with child. She had left Willowbrook as planned, but not before we had spent one final night together. One last goodbye in the old miller's cottage, One last moment of weakness, when we both knew it could change nothing. She had gone to Devon and found work as a seamstress, but her condition would soon be obvious, and she did not know what to do. She was not asking me to marry her, she said. She knew that was impossible, but she thought I should know. "What did you do?" I asked, though my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. "I went to her," he said. I rode to Devon and found her in a tiny room above a draper's shop, already showing despite the loose dresses she wore. She was so thin, Eleanor, so pale, and she was terrified. Not for herself, but for the child. She kept saying the baby deserved better than this, deserved a chance at life, deserved more than a disgraced mother and no father at all. He paused, swallowing hard, his composure fracturing. I arranged for her to be taken to a private house in the countryside, a place where women of gentle birth could go to have their babies in secret. It was the best I could do without exposing everything to my father. I paid for her care, for a physician, for everything she needed. And I visited when I could, always in secret, always knowing that when the child was born, Catherine would have to give it up. My father would never acknowledge a bastard, and Catherine could never raise the child on her own. But she died, I said. She died 3 hours after giving birth to a girl. The physician said it was childbed fever, that there was nothing that could have been done. But I have always wondered if it was simply grief. If knowing she would never see her daughter again broke something inside her that could not be repaired. She died with the baby in her arms, and the last thing she said to me was that the child's name should be Lily. After the flowers that grew in the garden at Willowbrook, the ones she used to pick on her walks with the Hartley children, I felt tears on my own cheeks, though I could not remember beginning to cry. The image he painted was so vivid, so heartbreaking, that it seemed to fill the room like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. "And the child?" I managed to ask. "Where is she now?" "She lives at a small estate called Rosewood, about 2 days' journey north of here. I purchased the property using funds from my mother's inheritance, the only money my father could not control. An elderly widow named Mrs. Fletcher lives there as Lily's nurse and companion. As far as anyone knows, Lily is the orphaned daughter of a distant cousin who died abroad. Mrs. Fletcher has raised her as if she were her own grandchild. She is 8 years old now, Eleanor. 8 years old. And I have seen her perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, always from a distance, always as a stranger." His voice broke completely on the last words, and I saw him press his fist against his mouth as if to hold back a sob. The sight undid something in me. Some final barrier I had erected against this man who had been my husband in name only. I rose from my chair and crossed the room to him, moving without thought, driven only by an instinct I had not known I possessed. I touched his arm tentatively, half expecting him to pull away. But instead he turned to me, and suddenly I was in his arms, and he was holding me with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness, years of carrying this burden alone. I felt his tears against my hair, felt the shuddering of his breath, and I held him in return. This stranger who was my husband. This man whose heart had been broken long before I entered his life. We stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing all meaning in the face of such raw emotion. Slowly, his breathing steadied, and he pulled back slightly, though he did not release me entirely. His hands rested on my arms, his eyes searching my face as if looking for something he had lost. "I am sorry," he said hoarsely. "You should not have to bear witness to this. You should not have to carry the weight of my past." I shook my head. "I am your wife," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Perhaps only in name, perhaps only by arrangement, but your burdens are mine as well. You should have told me before." "How could I?" he asked. "What could I have said? That I married you to satisfy my father's demands, but my heart was already buried with a woman I could never acknowledge? That every time I looked at you I felt the weight of my own cowardice? You deserved better than that, Eleanor. You deserved a husband who could give you more than empty courtesy and cold civility. And Lily deserves better than being hidden away like a shameful secret, I said, the words emerging before I fully understood what I was saying. She is your daughter, Edward. Your blood. She should be here, at Thornfield, where she belongs. His face twisted with something between hope and despair. My father would never have allowed it. And even now that he is gone, society will not be so forgiving. A bastard acknowledged is worse than a bastard hidden. It would ruin us both, and Lily as well. She is better off at Rosewood, protected by ignorance. Is she? I asked. Or is that simply what you tell yourself to make the sacrifice bearable? He pulled away from me then, walking to the window and staring out at the rain that had begun to fall again. I did not mean to speak so harshly, but something had shifted in me. Some long, dormant sense of righteousness awakening. This child, this innocent girl, deserved more than to be hidden away for the convenience of those who should have loved her most. There is something else, Edward said after a long silence, something you must know before the will is read. My father knew about Lily. I felt the blood drain from my face. How? I whispered. He discovered the truth 2 years ago. I do not know how, but he summoned me to Ravenswood and laid out everything he knew. Catherine's name, the house in Devon, Rosewood, Mrs. Fletcher, all of it. He was coldly furious, not because I had loved Catherine or fathered a child, but because I had deceived him, because I had used funds he could not control to establish a household for my bastard daughter. What did he do? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He altered his will. The details are complex, but the essence is this. If Lily's existence becomes publicly known, if she is acknowledged in any way as my daughter, the majority of the unentailed properties will be sold and the proceeds donated to various charitable institutions. The title and Thornfield itself will remain mine, as they must by law, but almost everything else will be stripped away. Rosewood will be taken. The funds that support Mrs. Fletcher and Lily's care will be confiscated, and Lily herself will be sent to an orphan asylum, as my father believed that any child born of sin deserved to be raised in hardship as punishment. The cruelty of it stole my breath. Your father would condemn an innocent child to that fate, I said, out of pride, out of spite. He turned to look at me, and I saw in his eyes a grief so profound it seemed to have no bottom. He would, and the will is ironclad. My solicitors have examined it thoroughly. There is no loophole, no way to contest it. If I acknowledge Lily, I destroy her. So I must continue to pretend she does not exist, must continue to be the cold and distant father who visits perhaps once a year and never stays long enough for her to remember my face. This is the prison my father built for me, Eleanor, and I will live in it until I die because I have no other choice. I sank back into my chair, my mind reeling. The weight of what he was telling me was almost too much to bear. This was not the simple tragedy of lost love. This was something darker, more insidious, a punishment that extended beyond the grave. A father's final act of control over a son who had dared to love against his wishes. When is the will to be read? I asked. Tomorrow afternoon. My father's solicitor will arrive from London by evening coach. The reading will take place at Ravenswood, as my father specified. All beneficiaries must be present, which includes me, my cousin Richard, and several charitable institutions named in the will. And me, I asked. Will I be there? You are not named in the will. My father made separate arrangements for your maintenance in the marriage settlement. But you may attend if you wish. As my wife, you have that right. I looked at him, at this man I had lived beside for 3 years without truly knowing, and made a decision that surprised even myself. I will come, I said. Whatever happens, whatever that will contains, you should not have to face it alone. Something flickered in his eyes, gratitude perhaps, or relief, or simply surprise that I would offer such support. He nodded slowly. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more than you know." He left my chambers soon after, pleading exhaustion and the need to prepare for the journey to Ravenswood. I watched him go, then sat alone in the gathering darkness, turning over everything he had told me. The story of Catherine and Lily had transformed my understanding of my own marriage entirely. The distance I had interpreted as coldness was grief. The absence I had read as indifference was guilt. Edward was not an unfeeling man. He was a man who felt too much and had learned to bury it all beneath layers of duty and obligation. And Lily. Somewhere in the north of England, a little girl with her father's eyes and her mother's red hair was growing up without knowing who she truly was, without understanding why she lived in a comfortable house with an elderly woman but never had a family of her own. 8 years old. The same age as my youngest sister had been when I left home to marry Edward. I remembered how small Anna had seemed at the wedding, how she had clung to me and begged me not to go. I had promised to write, to visit, to never forget her. And I had kept those promises as best I could, despite the distance and Edward's coldness. But Lily had no one to make her such promises. She had a father who loved her from afar and a dead mother who had held her for only 3 hours. She had comfort and care, but no truth, no identity, no place in the world beyond the walls of Rosewood. And if Edward's father's will was as cruel as he claimed, she would lose even that fragile security if her existence were ever acknowledged. I rose and lit a candle, the small flame pushing back the darkness, but doing nothing to warm the chill I felt deep in my bones. I thought of the ribbon still hidden in my jewelry box, that small scrap of pink silk that had unraveled everything. I wondered if Catherine had tied it in Lily's hair in those 3 precious hours before she died. If it had been her final gift, her final touch, the last connection between mother and child. The rain continued through the evening and into the night. I took dinner in my rooms, unable to face the formal dining room and its silent accusations. Margaret brought a tray and chattered about the servants' gossip regarding the old Duke's death, but I barely heard her. My mind was too full of Edward's confession, of Lily's lonely existence, of the impossible situation we now found ourselves in. Sleep eluded me again that night. I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl around the eaves of Thornfield, and I thought about choices and consequences, about duty and desire, about the ways in which one generation's cruelty could poison the lives of those who came after. Edward's father had built a trap for his son, a punishment that could never end because ending it meant destroying an innocent child. It was monstrous in its sophistication, in its understanding of exactly how to inflict the most exquisite pain. But as I lay there in the dark, another thought came to me, one that brought with it a strange sense of clarity. The old Duke was dead. His power was gone, dissolved in the moment his heart had stopped beating. The will might contain cruel provisions, but the will itself was just paper and ink, just words written by a bitter old man who could no longer enforce them. And more importantly, Edward was no longer alone in this knowledge. I knew now. I understood. And perhaps together we might find a way forward that the old Duke had never imagined possible. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the rain having finally stopped, but leaving behind a world sodden and colorless. I dressed carefully for the journey to Ravenswood, choosing a gown of black silk appropriate for mourning, though I felt no grief for the man we would supposedly honor. Margaret arranged my hair in a severe style, and I put on the diamonds Edward had given me on our wedding day, the only jewelry grand enough for such an occasion. Edward was waiting in the entrance hall when I descended, dressed in full mourning attire, his face composed, but his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw surprise and something else in his expression, something that might have been appreciation or gratitude. "You look well," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The journey to Ravenswood took 3 hours by carriage, the roads muddy from the rain and the going slow. Edward and I sat across from each other in silence for most of the trip, But it was a different silence than the ones we had shared before. Not empty, but full, weighted with all that had been said and all that remained unspoken. Occasionally our eyes would meet, and I would see in his face a question he did not know how to ask. I did not know how to answer it either, but I held his gaze and hoped he understood that something between us had shifted, that we were no longer quite the strangers we had been. Ravenswood appeared through the trees like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and leaded windows and ivy climbing the walls. It was larger than Thornfield, but somehow more oppressive, as if the building itself had absorbed the personality of the man who had lived there for 70 years. The carriage pulled up to the entrance, and servants in black came out to receive us, their faces appropriately solemn. Inside, the house was cold and dim despite the fires burning in every grate. We were shown to the library, where the reading of the will would take place, and I saw that others had already arrived. Edward's cousin Richard stood by the fireplace, a man of perhaps 40, with a dissolute face and restless eyes. He nodded to Edward with barely concealed hostility. Several other people I did not recognize occupied chairs around the room, representatives of charitable institutions, I assumed. The solicitor, a small man named Mr. Pemberton with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, rose to greet us. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Edward. "My lady. Thank you for coming. I believe we are ready to begin." We took our seats, Edward in the chair that had once been his father's, me beside him in a position I had never occupied before. Mr. Pemberton broke the seal on a thick sheaf of papers and began to read in a dry, precise voice that drained all emotion from the words. The will was complex, filled with legal language I struggled to follow, but gradually the provisions became clear. The title and Thornfield went to Edward, as expected. Various smaller properties were distributed to distant relatives. Generous sums were left to several charitable organizations. But then Mr. Pemberton's voice took on a harder edge as he reached the part of the will Edward had warned me about. In the matter of any illegitimate issue that may exist or come to light, the solicitor read, "I direct that should such issue be acknowledged publicly by my son and heir, the following consequences shall immediately take effect. First, all unentailed properties excluding Thornfield itself shall be sold at public auction, and the proceeds divided among the charitable institutions named herein. Second, any property purchased with funds from the Blackmore estate for the maintenance of such issue shall be confiscated and sold. Third, any illegitimate child discovered to be of my son's blood shall be removed from whatever situation they currently occupy and placed in the care of the London Foundling Hospital, there to be raised according to the principles of Christian discipline and moral rectitude appropriate to their unfortunate birth." The words fell like stones into still water, and I felt Edward go rigid beside me. Across the room, Richard's eyes narrowed with interest, as if he smelled blood in the water. The charitable representatives looked uncomfortable but unsurprised, as if they had been briefed on this provision beforehand. Mr. Pemberton continued reading, detailing the exact properties that would be affected, the timeline for the sales, the procedures for enforcement. It was all there, every detail carefully specified, every loophole sealed. The old Duke had thought of everything, had crafted his revenge with the precision of a master strategist. When the reading finally concluded, Mr. Pemberton looked up over his spectacles. "Are there any questions regarding the provisions of the will?" he asked. Edward's voice, when he spoke, was perfectly controlled. "No questions," he said. "The terms are quite clear." Richard stepped forward, a sneer playing at the corners of his mouth. "Quite an unusual provision, cousin. One might wonder what prompted such specific language. Unless, of course, there is something you wish to share with the family." "There is nothing to share," Edward said coldly. "My father's will reflects his own peculiar concerns. Nothing more." I felt my hands clenching in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just the punishment itself, But this public reading, this exposure of the old Duke's suspicions before witnesses who would carry the story far and wide. Even if Edward never acknowledged Lily, the rumors would begin. People would wonder. They would watch him, waiting for any sign of the illegitimate child the will suggested must exist. We left Ravenswood as soon as propriety allowed, Edward's face like carved stone as we walked to the carriage. Richard watched us go with calculating eyes, and I knew he would not let this mystery rest. He would dig, would search, would try to uncover any scandal that might work to his advantage. The journey back to Thornfield passed in silence, but when we were nearly home, Edward finally spoke. "Now you see," he said quietly. "Now you understand why I can never acknowledge her. My father's reach extends beyond the grave. He has won even in death." I looked at him, at the defeat in his eyes, and felt something harden inside me. "No," I said. "He has not won. Not yet. Not unless we allow it." He turned to me with a sad smile. "What choice do we have, Eleanor? The terms are clear. If I acknowledge Lily, I destroy her. Then we will not acknowledge her publicly," I said, the plan forming even as I spoke. "But that does not mean we cannot be part of her life. That does not mean she must remain alone." He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," I said carefully, "that there may be ways to honor the letter of your father's will while defying its spirit. Ways to give Lily what she deserves without triggering the provisions he put in place. But I will need time to think, and I will need your trust." The carriage pulled up to Thornfield, and servants came forward to help us down. Edward took my hand as I descended, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, he did not immediately release it. Instead, he held on, his grip tight, his eyes searching mine in the fading light. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Why would you risk anything for a child who is not yours, for a situation that existed before you ever came into my life?" I met his gaze steadily, and in that moment, I understood something about myself I had not known before. "Because she is 8 years old and alone," I said simply. "And because no child should be punished for the circumstances of her birth. And because," I added more softly, "I think I am tired of living in this house like a ghost, existing but not truly alive. Perhaps helping Lily is also a way of helping myself." Something shifted in Edward's face then, some barrier crumbling that had stood between us for 3 long years. He raised my hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that I felt tears prick my eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "Whatever happens, thank you for caring when you had no reason to." That night, I sat at my writing desk long after the house had gone silent, the ribbon spread before me in the candlelight, and I thought about the governess who had died for love, and the child who lived without it, and the husband I had never truly known. And I began to formulate a plan, dangerous and audacious and perhaps impossible, but a plan nonetheless. Because the old Duke might have thought of everything, but he had not thought of me. He had not anticipated that the quiet, biddable Duchess he had chosen for his son might have a will of her own and a heart that could be moved by the plight of a child she had never met. The ribbon caught the light, its pink silk glowing softly in the dimness, and I made a silent promise to the woman who had once worn it in her hair. "Your daughter will not be forgotten," I vowed. "She will not grow up alone and unnamed. Somehow, some way, I will find a path forward. Even if it means defying the dead and risking everything I have, I will give her what you could not. A mother's love, or the closest thing to it I can offer." Outside my window, the night was dark and still, but somewhere far to the north, a little girl was sleeping, innocent and unaware that her life was about to change in ways none of us could yet imagine. 3 days after the reading of the will, I told Edward I wished to visit Rosewood. We were at breakfast, a meal we had taken together every morning since his return from London, breaking the pattern of solitary dining that had defined our marriage. He looked up from his correspondence, surprise flickering across his face. "You wish to see her," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I wish to know her," I replied, setting down my teacup with careful precision. "If we are to help her, I must understand who she is, what she needs, what kind of life she is living now." Edward was silent for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the letter he held. "It is a 2-day journey," he said finally. "The roads are poor and the accommodations sparse, and if we are seen together traveling north, questions will be asked." "Then I will go alone," I said, "or with Margaret as my companion. We can say I am visiting a distant relation, that I require a respite from the morning atmosphere at Thornfield. No one will question a duchess seeking time away from the house where her father-in-law recently died." He studied me across the table, and I saw in his eyes both gratitude and something that looked like fear. "What if you do not like what you find?" he asked quietly. "What if Lily is not the innocent child we imagine? What if she is difficult or damaged by her circumstances, or simply unable to accept kindness from a stranger?" "Then we will work with what is," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "Children are resilient, Edward, and she has lived with love, has she not? Mrs. Fletcher cares for her genuinely. Mrs. Fletcher adores her," he said, his voice softening. "She is a kind woman who lost her own daughter to consumption years ago. Lily has filled that emptiness for her. But Mrs. Fletcher is 70 now, and her health is declining. I do not know how much longer she can continue to provide the care Lily needs." "Another reason for me to go," I said. "We must know the full situation before we can make any plans." He nodded slowly, then rose from the table and came to stand beside my chair. "When would you leave?" he asked. "Tomorrow," I said, "if you can make the arrangements." His hand touched my shoulder, a brief contact that sent unexpected warmth through me. "Be careful, Eleanor," he said, "and know that whatever you find, whatever you decide, I am grateful beyond words that you are willing to try." The journey north was exactly as Edward had described, long and uncomfortable, and marked by increasingly rough roads as we left the cultivated lands around Thornfield behind. Margaret accompanied me, excited by the adventure despite the rain that plagued us for most of the first day. We stopped overnight at a modest inn, where I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds and wondering what I would find at Rosewood, what I would say to a child who did not know I existed. We arrived at the estate late in the afternoon of the second day, the light already fading toward dusk. Rosewood was smaller than I had imagined, a manor house of perhaps 20 rooms set in a valley surrounded by gentle hills. The gardens were well tended but simple, lacking the formal grandeur of Thornfield. There was something peaceful about the place, something that spoke of quiet contentment rather than display. Mrs. Fletcher met us at the door, a small woman with white hair and kind blue eyes that immediately reminded me of my own grandmother. She had been expecting us, Edward having sent word ahead, and she welcomed us with genuine warmth despite the obvious anxiety in her manner. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying low, "it is an honor to receive you. His Grace wrote that you wished to meet Lily, though I confess I do not fully understand the purpose of your visit. I am interested in the welfare of all children connected to the Blackmore estates," I said, using the excuse Edward and I had prepared. "With the old Duke's passing, there are many matters to be reviewed and assessed. I hope my visit does not cause inconvenience." "Not at all, my lady." "Lily is in the music room practicing her pianoforte. She plays quite well for her age. Would you like to meet her now, or would you prefer to rest from your journey first?" "Now," I said, "before my courage could fail me, if that is acceptable." Mrs. Fletcher led me through corridors decorated simply but comfortably, past rooms filled with the warm evidence of daily life. I could see Lily's presence everywhere, in the books stacked on tables, in the small watercolors hanging on walls, in the shawl draped over a chair in a sitting room we passed. This was a home, not just a house, and I felt some of my tension ease, knowing that Edward's daughter had at least been given that much. The music room was at the back of the house, its windows overlooking a garden where the last roses of autumn still bloomed. And there, seated at a pianoforte that seemed almost too large for her small frame, was Lily. She was concentrating fiercely on her playing. Her tongue caught between her teeth in a way that made her look younger than her 8 years. Her hair was indeed red, a deep auburn that caught the lamplight and glowed like copper, and it fell in loose curls down her back, partially contained by a blue ribbon. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, and her feet barely reached the pedals of the instrument. As we entered, she finished the piece she was playing and looked up, and I felt my breath catch. She had Edward's eyes, that same gray-green shade that could look cold as winter or warm as spring depending on the light. But her features were finer, more delicate, and there was something in her expression that spoke of both intelligence and wariness, as if she had learned early to be careful about whom she trusted. "Lily, dear," Mrs. Fletcher said gently, "this is the Duchess of Blackmore. She has come to visit us from Thornfield Hall." Lily slipped off the bench and curtsied with perfect form, her eyes never leaving my face. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft and clear, "it is a pleasure to meet you." "And you, Lily," I said, moving closer. "That was beautiful playing. How long have you been learning?" 3 years, my lady. Mrs. Fletcher arranged for a music master to come twice weekly from the village. She says music is good for the soul." I smiled. Mrs. Fletcher is very wise. "May I sit with you for a moment?" She nodded, returning to the bench, and I sat beside her on the small seat, close enough to smell the lavender soap she had been washed with, close enough to see the scatter of freckles across her nose that Edward had described in Catherine. My heart ached looking at her, this child who should have been acknowledged and celebrated, but instead lived in hiding, loved but never fully claimed. "Do you know who I am, Lily?" I asked gently. "Beyond my title, I mean." She looked at me with those grave eyes, so much older than her years. "You are married to the Duke," she said carefully. "Mrs. Fletcher says he is a great man who owns many properties, and that we live here by his generosity." "That is true," I said. "But there is more to the story than that. May I tell you something just between us?" She nodded, her small hands folding in her lap in a gesture that reminded me painfully of Edward when he was anxious or uncertain. "I knew your mother," I said. And it was not quite a lie, because I felt I did know Catherine now, through Edward's stories and through the ribbon that connected us all. She was a very special woman, and she loved you more than anything in the world. Lily's face went very still. "Mrs. Fletcher says my mother died when I was born, that she was good and kind, but that I must not ask too many questions about her, because it makes people sad." "It does make people sad," I acknowledged. "But not because there is anything wrong with remembering her. Sometimes sadness and love exist together, Lily. Missing someone does not mean we should not talk about them." "Did you really know her?" Lily asked, and I heard the hunger in her voice, the desperate need to know something, anything, about the woman who had given her life. "I know that she was brave," I said. "I know that she loved books and learning, and that she dreamed of having a school someday where all girls could be educated. I know that she had red hair like yours, and that when she smiled, it was like sunshine breaking through clouds. And I know that the last thing she did before she died was hold you and name you Lily, after flowers she loved." Tears were sliding down Lily's cheeks now, silent and steady. She made no move to wipe them away, just sat very still, as if afraid that any movement would shatter this moment. "No one has ever told me these things before," she whispered. "Well," I said, my own voice thick with emotion, "I think it is time someone did. Would you like to hear more?" We talked for over an hour, Lily and I, while Mrs. Fletcher tactfully withdrew and Margaret waited in another room. I told her everything Edward had shared with me about Catherine, carefully editing out the parts that would hurt or confuse a child. I spoke of her mother's intelligence and kindness, of her love of nature and books, of the way she had seen beauty in small things. And Lily drank it all in like someone dying of thirst, asking questions, wanting details, needing to construct an image of the woman who had existed only as absence in her life. Eventually, Mrs. Fletcher returned with tea and cakes, and Lily showed me her watercolors, her needlework, the books she was reading. She was bright and curious, and surprisingly mature for 8 years old, but I could also see the loneliness in her, the way she had learned to entertain herself, to exist in a world where she was loved but somehow apart. She never mentioned wanting friends her own age, never spoke of missing social interactions. It was as if she had accepted isolation as the natural state of her existence. That night, after Lily had been put to bed, I sat with Mrs. Fletcher in her sitting room and spoke plainly about my concerns. "She is thriving in many ways," I said, "but she is also alone. She needs more than what this house can give her, no matter how much love you provide." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I know, Your Grace. I have told His Grace the same thing on his visits. But what can be done? The circumstances of her birth prevent her from having a normal life. She cannot go to school, cannot make friends, cannot be part of society. This is the best we can offer her. What if there were another way?" I said carefully. "What if she could have more, without exposing the truth of her parentage?" Mrs. Fletcher looked at me sharply. "What are you suggesting, my lady?" "I am not certain yet," I admitted, "but I am thinking. And I want you to know that I will not do anything that would harm Lily. If I can find a way to give her a better life, a fuller life, would you support it?" The old woman was quiet for a long time, studying my face in the firelight. "You love her already," she said finally. "I can see it in your eyes. You have been here only hours, and already you love her." I could not deny it. "Yes," I said simply, "I do." "Then you understand what His Grace has lived with all these years. The impossibility of loving a child you cannot claim, cannot protect, cannot give the life they deserve." "I understand it better now than I did before," I agreed. "But understanding a problem is not the same as accepting it. There must be a way forward, Mrs. Fletcher. There must be." She reached across and patted my hand with gentle affection. "You are a good woman, Your Grace. Better than I expected when His Grace wrote that you were coming. I hope you find what you are looking for Lily's sake, and for your own." I stayed at Rosewood for 3 more days, spending as much time as I could with Lily. We walked in the gardens, read together in the library, played simple games that made her laugh in a way that transformed her serious face into something luminous and carefree. I taught her a card game my sisters and I had loved, and she beat me soundly by the second round, her strategic mind working through possibilities with impressive speed. On the last afternoon, as we sat together in the music room while she played for me, I made a decision. "Lily," I said when she finished her piece, "would you like to come visit Thornfield sometime, to see where your fa, I caught myself just in time, where the Duke lives and works?" She turned to me with eyes wide with surprise and longing. "Could I?" she asked. Would His Grace, would he want me to visit?" "He would," I said firmly. "In fact, I think he would very much enjoy showing you the estate. There is a library there with thousands of books, and stables with beautiful horses, and gardens far grander than these. Would you like that?" "More than anything," she whispered. "Then it shall happen," I promised. "Soon, I will arrange it." The journey back to Thornfield felt shorter than the journey out, despite the continued poor weather. I spent the hours in the carriage thinking about Lily, about the way she had hugged me goodbye with fierce intensity, about the hope I had seen kindle in her eyes. I thought about Mrs. Fletcher's words, about already loving a child I had known for only 3 days. It was true, terrifyingly and completely true. Lily had walked into my heart and taken up residence as if she had always belonged there. Edward was waiting for me when I arrived home, pacing in the entrance hall with barely contained anxiety. When he saw me descend from the carriage, He strode forward, searching my face for I knew not what. "Well," he asked, "tell me everything." We went to his study, the room where he conducted the business of the estate, a space I had never been invited into before. He poured us both brandy, ignoring propriety, and we sat by the fire while I told him everything. About Lily's intelligence and grace, about her loneliness and maturity, about the way she had cried when I spoke of Catherine, about the hunger in her eyes for knowledge of her parents. "She has your eyes," I said, "and her mother's hair and spirit. She is extraordinary, Edward. And she is wasting away in that house, no matter how much Mrs. Fletcher loves her. She needs more. She deserves more." Edward's hands were shaking as he set down his glass. "What do we do?" he asked. "How do we give her more without destroying everything?" "I have been thinking about this," I said. "The will forbids public acknowledgement. It forbids claiming her as your daughter in any official or social capacity. But it says nothing about private visits, about friendship, about education and opportunity provided through seemingly charitable means." He leaned forward, hope and fear warring in his expression. "What are you proposing?" "A gradual introduction," I said. "We bring her to Thornfield for visits, but we present her as a young relation of mine, perhaps a cousin's child in need of supervision while her parents are abroad. No one knows my family well enough to question it. She visits, she learns, she experiences life beyond Rosewood, and slowly, carefully, she becomes part of our household without anyone suspecting the truth." "And when she is older," Edward asked, "when she begins to ask questions, to want answers." "When she is older," I said, "we will tell her the truth. Not the public, but her. She deserves to know who she is, who her parents were. She deserves to understand that she was loved, is loved, even if that love must remain hidden from the world." Edward stood and walked to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You would do this," he said. "You would take on the burden of this deception, risk everything if the truth were discovered, for a child who is not yours?" I rose and went to stand beside him. "She could be mine," I said quietly. "In every way that matters, Edward. You said yourself that your visits to my bed have been infrequent. If I were to become pregnant, if I were to deliver a child in, say, 8 or 9 months' time, who would question it? And if that child happened to be 8 years old rather than an infant, well, time is a funny thing. People see what they expect to see." He turned to stare at me, his face pale with shock. "You would claim her as your own child," he whispered. "You would tell the world you had given birth to her?" "Not immediately," I said. "That would be too obvious, too suspicious. But over time, as she becomes part of the household, as she becomes known as our ward or niece, we could gradually shift the story. By the time she makes her debut in society, no one will remember exactly how she came to be with us. They will simply accept that she is ours in some fashion, that she belongs at Thornfield." "It is too dangerous," Edward said, but I could hear the hope creeping into his voice despite his words. "If anyone investigated, if anyone discovered the truth, we would all be ruined. You most of all, Eleanor. You would be exposed as a liar, possibly prosecuted for fraud. I cannot ask that of you." "You are not asking," I said. "I am offering. And I have thought through the risks, Edward. Yes, there is danger. But there is also a child who needs parents, who needs a life, who needs to know she is wanted and loved. Is that not worth the risk?" He reached out and took my hands in his grip almost painful in its intensity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked again. "I still do not understand. What do you gain from helping us?" I looked up at him. This man I had married without love, but was beginning to understand with something that felt dangerously close to it. "I gain a purpose," I said honestly. "I gain a daughter. I gain the knowledge that I did something that mattered, something good and right and brave. And perhaps," I added more softly, I gain a real marriage, a real partnership, instead of this empty arrangement we have existed in for 3 years. Something broke in his expression then, some final wall crumbling. He pulled me into his arms and held me with desperate strength, his face buried in my hair. "I do not deserve you," he said hoarsely. "I have given you nothing but coldness and neglect, and yet you offer me everything. You offer her everything." "Then deserve me now," I said, my arms wrapping around him in return. "Be the man I believe you can be, the father Lily needs, the husband I hope to know. We can start over, Edward, all 3 of us together. We can build something real from these ashes." He pulled back just enough to look at me, and then, for the first time in our 3 years of marriage, he kissed me. Not the cold, dutiful kisses we had exchanged at our wedding, but a kiss that spoke of gratitude and hope, and the beginning of something that might, in time, become love. I kissed him back, and in that moment I felt the future shift and realign, felt possibilities opening that I had never imagined existed. When we finally separated, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for seeing us, for caring, for being brave enough to try." "We have a great deal of work to do," I said, allowing myself a smile. "We must plan carefully, move slowly, make sure every detail is perfect. But it can be done, Edward. I believe it can be done." We spent the rest of the evening making plans. Our heads bent together over his desk as we worked through logistics and timelines and potential complications. For the first time since our marriage, we were truly partners, working toward a common goal, united by something stronger than duty or obligation. We were united by love for a child who needed us both. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I took out the pink ribbon and held it in the candlelight. I had carried it with me to Rosewood, but had not shown it to Lily, knowing it was too soon, that there were some revelations that needed time and preparation. But someday, I promised myself, I would give it to her. I would tell her it had been her mother's, had been kept safe all these years by the father who loved her but could not claim her. I would give her that connection to the past, that tangible proof that she had been loved from the moment she drew breath. A knock at my door startled me from my reverie. Edward's voice came softly from the hallway. "Eleanor, may I come in?" I tucked the ribbon away and opened the door to find him standing there in his dressing gown, looking uncertain and vulnerable in a way I had never seen. "I wanted to say goodnight properly," he said, "and to tell you that, for the first time in 8 years, I feel something like hope." I took his hand and drew him into the room. "Then stay," I said. "Not out of duty, not out of obligation, but because we are beginning something new. Because we are choosing this, choosing each other, choosing to be a family for Lily and for ourselves." He stayed. And for the first time in our marriage, when he came to my bed, it was not in darkness and silence, but in gentle light and with words of tenderness and the slow discovery of what it might mean to truly be husband and wife. We were not yet in love, but we were on the path toward it, and that was enough. That was more than I had ever hoped for. In the weeks that followed, we set our plan in motion with careful precision. I wrote to my family, mentioning casually that a young cousin of mine might be coming to stay at Thornfield for an extended visit. Edward consulted with his solicitors about arranging for Lily's education, framing it as charitable interest in the welfare of all children on properties connected to the estate. We prepared a suite of rooms in the east wing of Thornfield, decorating them with care and thought for what an 8-year-old girl might enjoy. And through it all, we grew closer, Edward and I. We took meals together, walked in the gardens together, spent evenings in comfortable companionship reading or discussing our plans for Lily's future. We learned to talk to each other, to share thoughts and fears and hopes. We learned to laugh together, something I had never imagined possible in this cold house. Slowly, carefully, we were transforming Thornfield from a mausoleum into a home. and we were transforming ourselves from strangers bound by contract into partners bound by choice and purpose and the fragile beginnings of love. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after my visit to Rosewood. Mrs. Fletcher wrote that Lily was ready for her visit, that she had prepared her as much as possible without revealing too much, that the child could speak of nothing else but the promised trip to Thornfield. "She will arrive next week," I told Edward at breakfast, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. "Mrs. Fletcher will bring her, and we have agreed that she will stay for 1 month initially. If all goes well, we will extend the visit indefinitely." Edward reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that had become natural between us. "Are we ready?" he asked. "Is the house ready? Am I ready?" "We are as ready as we will ever be," I said. "And Lily needs this. She needs us. The rest we will figure out as we go." He nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the terror of a man about to be reunited with the daughter he had barely known. The child he loved with desperate intensity, but had never been allowed to parent. "What if she does not accept me?" he whispered. "What if she sees me as the stranger who abandoned her?" "Then we will teach her the truth," I said firmly, "that you have always loved her, have always wanted her, but were trapped by circumstances beyond your control. Children understand more than we give them credit for. Edward, she will understand in time." That week passed in a flurry of final preparations and rising anticipation. The servants were told that a young relation of mine would be visiting, and they accepted the story without question. Thornfield buzzed with energy it had not possessed in years, as if the house itself sensed that something fundamental was changing. And then, on a bright morning in early December, a carriage pulled up the drive carrying 2 passengers. Mrs. Fletcher emerged first, looking tired from the journey, but smiling. And then Lily stepped down, her red hair gleaming in the winter sunlight, her eyes wide as she took in the grandeur of Thornfield Hall. Edward and I stood on the steps waiting for them, and I felt him trembling beside me. This was the moment everything changed, the moment we stopped hiding and started truly living. The moment we became, in the ways that mattered most, a family. Lily curtsied to us both, her manners perfect as always, but then she looked up and met Edward's eyes, and I saw the instant of recognition, the moment she understood who he truly was, even though no words had been spoken. She knew. Perhaps she had always known, in the way children sometimes understand truths that adults try desperately to hide. "Welcome to Thornfield, Lily," I said, descending the steps to take her hand. "Welcome home." And as I led her into the house, Edward walking on her other side, I felt the last pieces of my own heart fall into place. This was what I had been missing, what I had needed without knowing it. Not just a child to love, but a purpose to fulfill, a family to build, a life that meant something beyond endless empty days in a beautiful prison. The old Duke had tried to destroy us all with his cruelty, his need for control extending even beyond death. But he had not counted on a lonely Duchess finding a pink ribbon, or on the power of love to overcome even the most carefully constructed barriers. He had not imagined that 3 broken people might find in each other the healing and wholeness they all desperately needed. As we stood together in the entrance hall of Thornfield, the 3 of us united by circumstance and choice and growing affection, I understood that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, dangers to navigate, secrets to keep, and eventually, perhaps, to reveal. But we would face them together, this family we were building from fragments and hope and stubborn determination. The ribbon had unraveled one mystery, but it had also woven together 3 lives that needed each other more than any of us had known. And standing there with Edward's hand in mine and Lily's eyes bright with wonder as she looked around her new home, I knew we had made the right choice. We had chosen love over fear, family over isolation, hope over despair. Whatever came next, we would face it as we faced this moment, together. Lily's first weeks at Thornfield transformed the house in ways I had not anticipated. The corridors that had echoed with emptiness for 3 years now rang with the sound of a child's laughter, with questions and discoveries and the patter of small feet racing from room to room. She approached everything with a hunger for experience that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, as if she were trying to absorb a lifetime of denied opportunities into these precious stolen weeks. She took her breakfast with us every morning, seated between Edward and me at the long dining table that had once felt oppressively vast. She chattered about her lessons, her explorations of the house, the books she was reading from the library. Edward would watch her with barely concealed wonder, drinking in every word, every gesture, storing up memories against some future drought. And I would catch his eye across the table and see reflected there the same joy and terror I felt. Joy at having her with us. Terror that it could not last, that somehow our carefully constructed story would crumble and she would be torn away. But in those early weeks, the fear remained distant, overshadowed by the daily miracles of watching a child bloom under attention and love. Lily showed Edward her watercolors, and he praised them with genuine enthusiasm, then arranged for a proper art master to come twice weekly from the village. She expressed interest in horses, and he spent an entire afternoon introducing her to every animal in the stables, lifting her onto the gentlest mare so she could experience the sensation of sitting astride such a magnificent creature. She asked endless questions about estate management, and he answered each one with patience, never dismissing her curiosity as inappropriate for a girl her age. And with me, she formed a bond that felt both natural and profound. She began calling me Aunt Eleanor within the first week, the title we had agreed upon as part of our story, but there was an intimacy to the way she said it that went beyond mere deception. She sought me out throughout the day, bringing me flowers from the conservatory, reading to me from her favorite books, asking my opinion on everything from the color of ribbons to the nature of friendship. She curled against me in the evening while I embroidered, her head resting on my shoulder, and I would stroke her red hair and feel a fierce protectiveness rise in my chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks after her arrival, she looked up at me with those grave eyes so like her father's and asked the question I had been dreading. "Aunt Eleanor," she said softly, "why do I feel like I belong here? Why does it feel like coming home when I have only just arrived?" I set aside my needlework and drew her closer. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "we recognize the people who are meant to be in our lives even before we fully understand why. You belong here, Lily, because we want you here, because you make this house feel alive in ways it never has before, because you are exactly where you are supposed to be. But Mrs. Fletcher loves me too," she said, a note of confusion in her voice. "And I love Rosewood. Yet I do not want to go back. Does that make me ungrateful?" "It makes you human," I said. "We can love more than one place, more than one person. And wanting to be somewhere does not diminish what came before. Mrs. Fletcher will always be important to you. But perhaps Thornfield can be important too. Perhaps you can have both." She seemed to accept this, nestling closer, and after a moment she said something that nearly undid me. "I think my mother would have liked you," she whispered. "I think she would be happy that I am here with you." I had to close my eyes against the tears that threatened. "I think she would be too," I managed. "And I think she would be very proud of the girl you are becoming." Not everything was perfect, of course. There were moments when Lily's loneliness showed through, when she would grow quiet and withdrawn, staring out windows with an expression too old for her young face. There were nightmares that had her crying out in the darkness, and I would go to her room and hold her until she calmed, stroking her hair and singing the lullabies my own mother had sung to me. There were questions about her parents that grew more pointed as she settled in, questions that Edward and I answered as truthfully as we could without revealing everything. And there was the constant awareness that we were living on borrowed time, that every day together was a gift that could be revoked without warning. The first real threat came 6 weeks into Lily's visit, when Edward's cousin Richard arrived unannounced one cold January afternoon. I was in the music room with Lily, listening to her practice a new piece, when Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed alarm. "Mr. Richard Ashford has arrived, my lady," she said. "He asks to see His Grace on a matter of some urgency." My heart sank. We had known Richard might eventually appear, drawn by curiosity about the will or simply by his usual mixture of greed and malice. But we had hoped for more time, for Lily to be more firmly established in the household before facing such scrutiny. "Where is His Grace?" I asked, keeping my voice calm for Lily's sake. "In his study, my lady. He has asked that you join them once Mr. Ashford has been received." I nodded, then turned to Lily with what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Continue practicing, dear. I will return shortly. Perhaps Margaret can sit with you?" Once Lily was settled with my maid for company, I made my way to Edward's study with a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. Richard was precisely the kind of man who would delight in uncovering scandal, who would use any weakness he found to his advantage. If he suspected the truth about Lily, if he began asking questions or making inquiries, everything we had built could collapse. Edward was standing by the window when I entered, his face carefully composed, but his hands clenched behind his back. Richard lounged in a chair by the fire, a glass of Edward's best brandy in his hand, and a smile on his lips that made my skin crawl. "Ah, the Duchess," Richard said, rising with exaggerated courtesy. "How lovely to see you, cousin, and how unexpectedly domestic you appear here at Thornfield. Quite different from the empty mausoleum it was last time I visited." "We are enjoying a quieter life," I said evenly, taking a seat and arranging my skirts with deliberate calm. "Was there something specific that brought you to call, Mr. Ashford?" Edward mentioned a matter of urgency. Richard's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Oh, nothing too pressing," he said. "I simply wanted to congratulate my cousin on his recent good fortune. Inheriting the bulk of the estate despite our late uncle's rather peculiar will, and to satisfy my curiosity about certain rumors I have been hearing." "What rumors?" Edward asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, just idle talk. You know how servants gossip, how word spreads between households. I heard something quite interesting from my valet, who heard it from a maid at the Rose and Crown, who heard it from one of your grooms. It seems there is a child residing at Thornfield now, a young girl with red hair, around 8 or 9 years of age. The servants say she is the Duchess's relation, but no one seems to know exactly which relation or from what branch of the family. Rather mysterious, do you not think?" "She is my cousin's daughter," I said smoothly, the lie we had prepared flowing easily from my lips. "The child of my mother's sister's son, James Hartwell. He and his wife are currently in India on business and felt it better for their daughter to be educated in England. We offered to take her for the duration of their absence." "How generous," Richard purred. "And yet I have made some inquiries, and I cannot seem to find any record of a James Hartwell connected to your family. No christening records, no marriage announcements, nothing at all." "My mother's family was quite extensive," I said, allowing a trace of frost to enter my voice. "Not every distant relation makes their way into the society pages, Mr. Ashford, and I find your inquiries into my family connections rather presumptuous, if you will forgive me for saying so." Richard laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "I mean no offense, dear Duchess. I am simply curious, especially given the provisions of my late uncle's will regarding illegitimate children. One cannot help but wonder if there might be some connection." Edward moved then, crossing the room to stand behind my chair, his presence a silent warning. "You are treading on dangerous ground, Richard," he said softly. "I suggest you consider carefully before making any accusations you cannot substantiate." "I make no accusations," Richard said, rising and setting down his glass. "I merely observe. I merely wonder. And I merely wish to ensure that the provisions of the will are being properly honored. After all, if certain facts were to come to light, if certain revelations were to be made public, well, The consequences would be quite severe, would they not? For everyone involved. The threat hung in the air between us, ugly and unmistakable. Richard was fishing, testing, trying to provoke some reaction that would confirm his suspicions. But he had no proof, nothing concrete, only gossip and intuition. Still, he was dangerous precisely because he was persistent and because he had nothing to lose by causing trouble. "I think it is time for you to leave," Edward said, his voice colder than I had ever heard it. "You have delivered your congratulations and satisfied your curiosity. Unless you have actual business to discuss, your presence here is neither required nor desired." Richard smiled, that shark-like expression that made me want to move Lily far away from his reach. "Of course, cousin," he said, "I shall take my leave, but I may return soon. I find I have developed quite an interest in family genealogy recently. It is fascinating what one can discover with enough digging." After he left, Edward and I remained frozen for several heartbeats, listening to the sound of his carriage departing down the drive. Then Edward turned to me, his face pale with barely suppressed fury and fear. "He knows," Edward said, "or he suspects strongly enough that it amounts to the same thing." "He has no proof," I said, though my own hands were shaking. "And suspicion is not enough to trigger the provisions of the will. We simply need to be more careful, to ensure our story holds up under scrutiny." "He will investigate," Edward said, beginning to pace. "He will search for records of James Hartwell, will question servants, will try to find any crack in our story. And if he discovers the truth about Rosewood, about Mrs. Fletcher, if he finds any connection between Lily and Catherine, we are finished." "Then we must move faster than he can," I said, my mind already racing through possibilities. "We must ensure that Lily's presence here becomes so established, so unremarkable, that by the time Richard completes his investigations, there will be no point in revealing what he finds." Edward stopped pacing and looked at me with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean we make her one of us, completely and publicly, before Richard can act. We introduce her to society in small ways, have her meet our neighbors, establish her as part of the household beyond any doubt. We make it impossible for anyone to imagine Thornfield without her. And we do it quickly, before Richard's inquiries bear fruit." "It is risky," Edward said. "Every public appearance increases the chance that someone will recognize some resemblance, will remember Catherine, will put together pieces we want to remain separate." "Everything about this situation is risky," I countered. "But hiding Lily away only makes Richard more suspicious. If we act naturally, if we treat her presence as completely ordinary and expected, people will accept what we tell them. They will have no reason to look deeper." He came to kneel beside my chair, taking my hands in his. "You are so brave," he said wonderingly, "so much braver than I have ever been. How did I ever deserve you?" "You did not deserve me," I said with a small smile, "any more than I deserved you. But perhaps we deserve each other now. Perhaps we have earned this, Edward, this family, this happiness, and I will fight to keep it with everything I have." He kissed me then, there in his study where servants might enter at any moment, a kiss that spoke of gratitude and growing love and shared determination. When we finally separated, I saw in his eyes the same fierce resolve I felt in my own heart. We would protect Lily. We would protect our family. Whatever it cost, whatever risks we had to take, we would not allow Richard or anyone else to destroy what we were building. That evening at dinner, I announced to Lily that we would be having visitors the following week. The Hartley family from Willowbrook, Catherine's former employers, had accepted our invitation to tea. It was a calculated risk, introducing Lily to people who had known her mother, but it was also necessary. If Lily was to be part of society, she needed to be seen and accepted by our neighbors. And the Hartleys were kind people who would, I hoped, see only a charming child rather than a resemblance to their former governess. Lily was both excited and nervous about the prospect of meeting new people. She asked endless questions about proper behavior, about what to wear, about what topics of conversation were appropriate. Edward and I coached her gently, but I could see the anxiety building in her young frame, the fear of saying or doing something wrong. The night before the Hartleys were to visit, I went to Lily's room to say goodnight and found her sitting at her window, staring out at the dark gardens. When she heard me enter, she turned, and I saw tears on her cheeks. "What troubles you, sweetheart?" I asked, sitting beside her and drawing her into my arms. "What if they do not like me?" she whispered. "What if I say something wrong and they think I am foolish or improper? What if they send me away?" "Oh, Lily," I said, my heart breaking for her insecurity. "No one is going to send you away. You are part of this family now. Nothing you could say or do would change that." "But I am not really family, am I?" she said, and there was a wealth of hurt in her voice. "I am just visiting. Eventually I will have to go back to Rosewood, will I not?" I held her tighter, knowing I could not make promises I might not be able to keep, but needing desperately to give her some sense of security. "You are family in every way that matters," I said firmly. "Blood is not the only thing that makes a family, Lily. Love makes a family. Choice makes a family, and we have chosen you, just as surely as you have chosen us. Do you understand?" She nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel her continued trembling. "There is something else," she said after a moment. "Something I need to tell you, but I am afraid." "You can tell me anything," I assured her. "There is nothing you could say that would make me love you less." She pulled back to look at me, her eyes huge and frightened in the lamplight. "I know," she whispered, "about my father. I have known for a long time, even before I came here. I know who he is." My breath caught. "How?" I managed to ask. "How did you know?" "Mrs. Fletcher talks in her sleep sometimes," Lily said. "I heard her once, maybe 2 years ago, saying his name. The Duke." She was dreaming, I think, worried about what would happen to me. And then I remembered his visits to Rosewood, the way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching. The sadness in his eyes. I understood then. I have always understood. "Oh, Lily," I breathed, my mind reeling with implications. "Why did you never say anything?" "Because I was afraid," she said simply. "Afraid that if I acknowledged what I knew, something would change, that maybe the visits would stop entirely, that maybe I would lose even the small connection I had. So I pretended not to know. I was good at pretending. But then I came here, and I saw the way he looks at me now, the way you both look at me, and I cannot pretend anymore. I cannot keep being silent about what I know." "Does it change anything?" I asked carefully. "Knowing the truth? Does it make you angry or hurt or—" "It makes me sad," she interrupted. "Sad that he could not claim me. Sad that my mother died. Sad that everything has to be secret and hidden. But it does not make me love him less, or you. If anything, it makes me love you both more, because I know you are risking so much to give me this. To give me a chance at a real family." I pulled her close again, this remarkable child who was far older than her years, who carried burdens no 8-year-old should have to bear. "You will have a real family," I promised. "We will find a way, Lily. I swear to you, we will find a way." "Should I tell him?" she asked. "That I know?" "Not yet," I said, thinking quickly. "Let us get through this visit with the Hartleys first. Let us make sure you are firmly established here, beyond Richard's reach. And then, when the time is right, we will all sit down together and speak openly about everything, the truth, the past, and the future we want to build. Is that acceptable?" She nodded, and I saw some of the tension leave her small shoulders. "Thank you, Aunt Eleanor," she said. "Thank you for not lying to me. Thank you for treating me like I am old enough to understand." "You are far older than you should be," I said with a sad smile. "But that is not your fault. and we will do everything we can to give you back some of the childhood that was taken from you." The next afternoon, the Hartleys arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. Lord and Lady Hartley were in their 50s. Kindly people who had always treated Edward and me with warmth, despite our formal and distant marriage. Their 3 children had all married and moved away, and I suspected they missed having young people about. When I introduced them to Lily, Lady Hartley's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "What a lovely child," she exclaimed, taking Lily's hand. "And such beautiful hair. It reminds me of—" She paused, a slight furrow appearing between her brows. "Well, never mind. It is simply lovely." My heart seized for a moment, fearing recognition, but Lord Hartley was already engaging Lily in conversation about her interests, and the moment passed. We took tea in the drawing room, and Lily performed beautifully, answering questions with poise, showing interest in the Hartleys' stories, and generally charming them completely. By the time they left an hour later, Lady Hartley had invited us all to dine at Willowbrook the following month, and had extracted a promise from Lily to play the pianoforte for them. After they departed, Edward found me in the library and pulled me into his arms. "She was magnificent," he said, his voice thick with pride. "Did you see how they took to her? How natural she seemed." "I did," I said, allowing myself to relax into his embrace. But I also saw Lady Hartley's moment of recognition when she saw Lily's hair. She remembered Catherine, Edward. She did not make the connection fully, but the resemblance registered. "But she said nothing," he pointed out. "And even if she did remember Catherine, what of it? Many people have red hair. It is not proof of anything." "No," I agreed, "but it is a reminder that we must always be careful, that the past is not so far away as we might wish." The weeks that followed established a pattern of careful social integration. We had tea with several neighboring families, attended church where Lily was introduced as my young relation, and began inviting select acquaintances to small dinners at Thornfield. Each time, Lily conducted herself with grace and intelligence, winning hearts and establishing herself as a beloved member of our household. But we also received regular letters from Richard, always full of seemingly innocent questions and observations that barely concealed his continued investigation. He wrote asking about my mother's family, suggesting we might collaborate on a family tree. He mentioned having visited various county record offices, researching the Hartwell line. He dropped hints about interesting discoveries he was making, always stopping just short of actual accusation. Edward grew increasingly tense under this pressure, but I counseled patience. "Let him investigate," I said. "He will find nothing concrete because James Hartwell does not exist. And by the time he exhausts his inquiries, Lily will be so thoroughly established here that even proof of deception would not be enough to destroy us." But there was one thing I had not accounted for, one weakness in our carefully constructed defenses. Mrs. Fletcher's declining health meant that Rosewood sat empty except for a skeleton staff, and empty houses attract attention. When I received a letter from the elderly housekeeper, there informing me that a gentleman matching Richard's description had been asking questions in the nearby village, I knew we had a serious problem. "Edward," I said that evening after Lily had gone to bed, "we need to close Rosewood, permanently. Pay off the staff, sell the furnishings, make it appear that the house was only ever a temporary arrangement. If Richard connects Lily to that property, he will have the evidence he needs." Edward paled. "But Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "where will she go? She has nowhere else." "She can come here," I said. "We can say she is another elderly relation, that we are consolidating households for economy. It is not unusual for families to care for aging relatives. And having her here will actually strengthen our story. If Lily's supposed parents are abroad, of course an elderly relation would be involved in her care." It was decided. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Fletcher arrived at Thornfield with the few possessions she wished to keep, and Rosewood was closed and emptied. The speed with which we accomplished this must have frustrated Richard's investigation, but it also increased his suspicion. He knew we were hiding something. He simply could not prove what. The crisis came in early March, on a day that had begun ordinarily enough. Lily was in the music room with her teacher, Edward was meeting with his steward, and I was in the morning room answering correspondence when Mrs. Holloway appeared with a visitor's card. "Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor, has arrived, my lady," she said. "He says it is a matter of some urgency regarding the will." My stomach dropped. "Show him to the library," I said, "and fetch his grace immediately." Mr. Pemberton looked grave when Edward and I joined him minutes later. He held several documents in his hands, and his expression was carefully neutral in a way that terrified me. "Your Grace, my lady," he began. "I am afraid I must inform you of a development that may have serious implications. Mr. Richard Ashford has filed a formal inquiry with the courts, claiming that the provisions of the late Duke's will regarding illegitimate issue may have been violated. He has presented evidence suggesting that a child living at Thornfield may in fact be the natural daughter of His Grace, and that by harboring this child here, you are effectively acknowledging her in violation of the will's terms." "What evidence?" Edward asked, his voice deadly calm. Mr. Pemberton shuffled through his papers. "Testimony from servants at a property called Rosewood, stating that His Grace visited there regularly over the past 8 years. Records of financial transactions from your personal accounts to Mrs. Fletcher, a woman with no apparent connection to the Blackmore estate. Statements from villagers near Rosewood describing a red-haired child who bore a remarkable resemblance to a governess named Catherine Webb, who died 8 years ago. And most damning, parish records from Devon showing the death of Catherine Webb shortly after childbirth, with no father listed but a notation suggesting the child survived." "It is all circumstantial," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "None of that proves the child living here is the same child born to Miss Webb. My cousin's daughter happens to have red hair, which is hardly unusual. As for the financial transactions, many gentlemen support elderly retainers from their personal funds, and visits to various properties can have any number of explanations." Mr. Pemberton nodded slowly. "That is precisely what I told Mr. Ashford's solicitor. However, he has requested that the court examine the child in question to determine her age and background, and to question her directly about her parentage. If she can be proven to be the child born to Catherine Webb, and if it can be shown that His Grace has been supporting her all these years, the court may rule that the spirit, if not the letter of the will, has been violated." "When?" Edward asked. "When would this examination take place?" "A date has been set for 1 month hence. The court will send an examiner to Thornfield to interview the child and review any documents pertaining to her identity and presence here. 1 month. We had 1 month to decide what to do, how to protect Lily from this invasion, how to save everything we had built." I looked at Edward and saw my own fear and determination reflected in his eyes. We had come too far to surrender now. We had fought too hard to give up without exhausting every possibility. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton," I said. "We will consider our options and respond appropriately." After the solicitor left, Edward and I stood in the library in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us like a physical force. Finally, I spoke the thought that had been forming since Mr. Pemberton delivered his news. "We have to tell her," I said. "We have to tell Lily everything, and we have to do it now. She deserves to know what is coming, to be prepared for what the court may ask her, and she deserves to help decide her own future." Edward nodded slowly. "You are right. She is intelligent enough, mature enough to understand, and if she is to be questioned, she needs to know the truth so she can speak from genuine conviction rather than rehearsed lies." That night, after Mrs. Fletcher had retired and the servants had withdrawn, the 3 of us sat together in Edward's study. Lily looked between us with worried eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Lily," I began gently, "there is something we need to tell you. Something you may have already guessed, but that we have never spoken of openly." "I know," she said quietly. "I know who my father is. I have known for some time. Edward's breath caught audibly. Lily, he began, but she stood and crossed to him, placing her small hand on his arm. You are my father, she said simply, and Catherine Webb was my mother. And you have loved me all my life, but could never claim me because of your own father's cruelty. I know all of this. I have always known. Edward's composure finally broke. He pulled her into his arms and wept openly, this man who had held himself so rigidly controlled for so many years. I am sorry, he sobbed. I am so sorry I could not give you the life you deserved, the acknowledgement you should have had. I am sorry you have lived in shadows because of my cowardice. You were not a coward, Lily said fiercely, her own tears falling freely. You were trapped. We were all trapped. But Aunt Eleanor found a way to free us, did she not? She brought us together. She made us a family. I moved to join them, wrapping my arms around both of them, and we stood there in a tight circle, this family born of tragedy and stubbornness and love. When we finally separated, I explained the situation with Richard and the court examination. So we have a choice, I said. We can continue the fiction, coach you on what to say, hope that you can convince the examiner you are who we claim you are. Or we can tell the truth, acknowledge everything publicly, and face the consequences of the will's provisions together. What would the consequences be? Lily asked. Edward explained as gently as he could about the properties that would be sold, the money that would go to charity. But then his voice grew softer. You would be sent to the London Foundling Hospital, he said, away from us, away from everything you have known. That is what my father's will demands. Lily's face went pale, but she lifted her chin with a courage that made my heart swell with pride. Then we cannot tell the truth, she said, because I will not let that happen. I will not let them separate us. So we must make them believe the story. We must make them think I truly am Aunt Eleanor's cousin's child. Are you certain? I asked. This examination will not be pleasant, Lily. They will ask difficult questions, try to catch you in lies. It will require you to be very brave and very careful. I can do it, she said with absolute conviction, because I understand now what is at stake. Not just money or property, but our family. And that is worth fighting for. We spent the remaining weeks preparing as best we could, crafting a complete history for the fictional James and Elizabeth Hartwell, memorizing details that Lily might be expected to know. We practiced interviews, challenged her story from every angle, helped her build confidence in the fiction we had created. And through it all, I marveled at her strength, her determination, her absolute refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed many adults. The night before the examiner was to arrive, I went to Lily's room, as had become my custom. She was sitting at her window again, looking out at the spring gardens that were just beginning to bloom. Are you frightened? I asked, settling beside her. Yes, she admitted, but I am also angry. Angry that we have to do this, that we have to lie and pretend and hide who we really are. Angry that anyone would think I should be punished for existing. I pulled her close. You are right to be angry, I said. The situation is unjust and cruel. But anger can also be strength, Lily. Use it tomorrow. Let it make you fierce and unshakable. Show them that you are exactly who you claim to be, and that no one has the right to question or judge you. Will you be there? She asked. During the examination? Every moment, I promised. I will not leave you alone to face this. Good, she said, and then, more softly, I love you, Aunt Eleanor. Not because I have to, not because of the story we are telling, but truly. You have given me what I always wanted, a mother's love. My tears came then, hot and fast, and I held her while she held me, two souls who had found in each other something essential that had been missing. I love you too, I whispered, more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. You are my daughter in every way that matters, Lily, and I will protect you with everything I have. tomorrow would bring its trials and terrors. The examiner would come with his questions and scrutiny. Richard would hover in the background, waiting for our story to crumble, and all of society would watch to see if the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore had committed a fraud that would ruin them forever. But tonight, we were simply a family. Imperfect and unconventional and built on secrets, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. And whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the future held, we would face it together. The three of us against the world, united by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than law. As I left Lily's room and walked back to my own chambers where Edward waited, I thought about that pink ribbon that had started everything. That small scrap of silk that had unraveled one mystery and woven together 3 lives. It sat now in Lily's jewelry box, a gift I had given her just days before, along with the story of how her mother had treasured it, how her father had kept it close all these years. She had held it gently, reverently, as if touching something sacred. And perhaps it was. Perhaps that ribbon was the thread that connected past to present, loss to hope, tragedy to redemption. Perhaps it represented everything we were fighting to preserve and protect. Tomorrow we would stand in the fire and prove our worth. Tomorrow we would defend our right to be a family, to love whom we chose, to defy the cruel provisions of a dead man's will. Tomorrow we would show Richard and the court and all of society that some bonds could not be broken by law or custom or malicious investigation. But tonight, we rested. Tonight, we took comfort in what we had built. Tonight, we were simply home. The examiner arrived precisely at 10 o'clock on a gray April morning, accompanied by Richard and 2 clerks who would record the proceedings. Mr. Pemberton was also present, representing our interests, and the drawing room where we gathered felt less like a comfortable family space and more like a courtroom preparing for judgment. The examiner was a man named Mr. Thornberry, perhaps 60 years old, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted us with professional courtesy, but no warmth, and I could see him assessing everything, from the quality of our furnishings to the tension in Edward's shoulders to the way I kept one hand protectively on Lily's arm. Lily wore a dress of pale blue muslin, her red hair arranged simply but elegantly, and she looked every inch the well-bred child we claimed her to be. But I could feel the trembling in her small frame, the fear she was working so hard to conceal. I gave her arm a gentle squeeze, trying to convey strength and reassurance through that simple touch. Mr. Thornberry settled into his chair and arranged his papers with meticulous precision. Then he looked at Lily with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, simply evaluating. "Miss Hartwell," he began, "that is your name, is it not?" "Yes, sir," Lily replied, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she felt. "Lily Catherine Hartwell. And you are currently residing at Thornfield Hall as a guest of the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. I came to stay with my Aunt Eleanor, the Duchess, while my parents are abroad." "Tell me about your parents," Mr. Thornberry said. "What are their names and where are they currently residing?" Lily recited the story we had prepared with perfect composure. "My father is James Hartwell, and my mother is Elizabeth. They traveled to India in September of last year for my father's business interests in textiles. They felt it would be better for my education if I remained in England, so Aunt Eleanor kindly offered to take me in." Mr. Chu. Thornberry made notes, his pen scratching across paper in a way that set my nerves on edge. "And what do you remember of your life before coming to Thornfield? Where did you live?" "We lived at Rosewood, a small estate in the north, with Mrs. Fletcher, who helped care for me. It was quiet there, but comfortable. I learned my letters and practiced the pianoforte and walked in the gardens." "Did you ever meet the Duke of Blackmore before coming to Thornfield?" Lily's pause was perfectly calculated, suggesting thoughtful consideration rather than rehearsed response. "I believe he visited once or twice," she said. "But I was very young and do not remember clearly. He is a friend of my parents, I think, though they never spoke much of him in my hearing. I watched Richard's face as she spoke and saw frustration building there. He had expected her to slip, to reveal something damning, but Lily was letter-perfect, her answers neither too elaborate nor too sparse, her manner that of a truthful child rather than a coached one. The questioning continued for over an hour, Mr. Thornberry probing every aspect of Lily's supposed history. He asked about her grandparents, about family traditions, about memories that should exist if her story were true. And Lily navigated each question with remarkable skill, using the details we had invented, but also knowing when to admit gaps in her knowledge that would be natural for a child her age. Then Mr. Thornberry's questions took a sharper turn. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "has anyone ever told you that you resemble a woman named Catherine Webb?" I felt my heart stop. This was the trap, the connection we had feared. Lily's face showed only polite confusion. "No, sir," she said. "I do not know anyone by that name." "Who is she?" "She was a governess who died about 8 years ago," Mr. Thornberry said, watching Lily's reaction carefully. "She had red hair, much like yours, and she lived not far from Rosewood. Some people have remarked on a resemblance." Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "I have been told that many people have red hair, sir," she said, with the guileless logic of a child, "and that resemblances can be coincidental. But I have never heard of Miss Webb. Perhaps you could ask my parents about her when they return from India." It was a masterstroke. That last sentence, simultaneously deflecting the question and reinforcing the fiction of her absent parents. I saw Mr. Thornberry's lips thin with what might have been either annoyance or approval at her cleverness. Richard could contain himself no longer. He leaned forward from his position near the window. "Surely you must find it suspicious, Mr. Thornberry," he said. "A child appears from nowhere, bearing remarkable resemblance to a woman who bore my cousin's illegitimate daughter, living in a house my cousin regularly visited. The coincidences are too great to ignore." Mr. Thornberry turned his cool gaze on Richard. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I will thank you to allow me to conduct this examination without interference. Your suspicions are noted, but they are not evidence. And this child has thus far answered every question satisfactorily." "But surely you can see," Richard began, only to be cut off by Mr. Thornberry's raised hand. "What I see," the examiner said coldly, "is that you have brought an accusation without proof. Resemblance is not proof. Coincidence is not proof. And unless you can provide documentation that this child is anyone other than whom she claims to be, I must accept the testimony before me at face value." "The records from Rosewood," Richard said desperately. The servants there confirmed that the Duke visited regularly, that he showed unusual interest in the child residing there. "The Duke is a conscientious landlord who visits many properties, Mr. Thornberry replied, "and showing kindness to a tenant's child is hardly evidence of paternity." "Do you have any actual proof, Mr. Ashford? Birth records, sworn testimony, anything beyond circumstantial observation and gossip?" Richard's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "I have testimony from those who knew Catherine Webb," he said, "who remember her well enough to swear that this child could be her daughter." "Could be is not the same as is," Mr. Thornberry said. "And even if this child did resemble Miss Webb, that would prove nothing. Many children resemble people to whom they have no blood relation. Unless you can produce definitive evidence, this examination is concluded." I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had been holding so tightly I had forgotten it was there. It was not quite victory, not yet, but it was something. Mr. Thornberry had not been convinced by Richard's circumstantial evidence. He had found Lily's testimony credible. We had a chance. Mr. Thornberry turned back to Lily with an expression that had softened slightly. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "one final question. Are you happy here at Thornfield Hall?" Lily's answer came without hesitation, and the emotion in her voice was entirely genuine. "Yes, sir," she said, "very happy. Aunt Eleanor and the Duke have been wonderfully kind to me." "I feel," She paused, and I saw tears glisten in her eyes. I feel as though I have finally found a home. Mr. Thornberry studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you. Miss Hartwell, you have been most cooperative. He turned to Edward and me. Your Grace, my lady, I will need to review all available documentation and consult with the court before making my final determination. However, I must say that I find Miss Hartwell's testimony to be coherent and convincing. Without stronger evidence to contradict her account, I am inclined to accept it at face value. Richard made a sound of protest, but Mr. Thornberry silenced him with a look. Mr. Ashford, unless you can produce concrete evidence within 1 week, I will be recommending to the court that your inquiry be dismissed. These accusations are serious, and they require serious proof. Suspicion and resemblance are not sufficient. After they left, Edward and I remained frozen for several heartbeats. Then Lily burst into tears, all the courage and composure she had maintained throughout the examination finally breaking. I pulled her into my arms and held her while she sobbed, while all the fear and stress of the past weeks poured out of her small frame. You were magnificent, I whispered into her hair. So brave, so perfect. You saved us all, my darling girl. Edward knelt beside us, his arms encircling both of us, and we stayed that way for a long time, a tight circle of relief and love and overwhelming gratitude that we had survived the first battle. But I knew it was not over. Richard had 1 week to find evidence, and he was not a man who gave up easily. The next days passed in anxious waiting, jumping at every knock on the door, every letter that arrived, every unexpected visitor. Edward threw himself into estate work with desperate energy, trying to distract himself from the uncertainty. I tried to maintain normalcy for Lily's sake, continuing her lessons and routines as if nothing were wrong. But the strain showed in all of us, in the tightness around Edward's eyes, in my restless nights, in the way Lily would sometimes go very still and quiet, lost in worries too heavy for a child to carry. The letter arrived on the 6th day. It was from Mr. Thornberry, and my hands shook as I broke the seal and read his words. Edward stood beside me, one hand gripping my shoulder, while Lily hovered nearby, her young face pale with anxiety. After extensive review of all available evidence and documentation, Mr. Thornberry had written in his precise hand, and after interviewing Miss Lily Hartwell at length, I have found no substantive proof that contradicts her stated identity and parentage. While Mr. Richard Ashford has raised concerns regarding coincidences and resemblances, such circumstantial observations do not constitute legal evidence of fraud or deception. Therefore, I am recommending to the court that his inquiry be dismissed and that no further action be taken regarding the provisions of the late Duke's will. The child residing at Thornfield Hall appears to be exactly who she claims to be, a young relation of the Duchess being cared for during her parents' absence abroad. I see no reason to pursue this matter further. I read the words aloud, my voice breaking with emotion, and when I finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then Lily let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and suddenly we were all embracing, all crying and laughing together, the relief so profound it was almost painful. We won, Edward said wonderingly. We actually won. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew we were not truly safe. Richard would not accept defeat gracefully. He would continue to watch us, to search for any slip that might revive his case. And there was still the fundamental problem that Lily could never be fully, legally ours as long as the provisions of the will remained in effect. That night, after Lily had gone to bed still flushed with victory and relief, Edward and I sat together in his study and faced the uncomfortable truth. This is not over, I said. Even if Richard stops his formal investigation, the threat remains. Lily can never be acknowledged as your daughter. She will always have to live with this fiction, this lie about who she is. And what happens when she is older, when she wants to make her debut in society, when she wants to marry? How do we explain the absence of her supposed parents then? Edward poured us both brandy and came to sit beside me on the sofa, his body close to mine in a way that had become natural over the past months. "I have been thinking about that," he said, "and I believe there may be a solution, a permanent solution, but one that requires sacrifice." "Tell me," I said. "The entailed properties cannot be touched," he began. "The title, Thornfield, the core of the estate, all of that must pass to me and eventually to any legitimate heir. But the unentailed properties, the ones my father threatened to sell if I acknowledged Lily, those I can dispose of as I choose. What if I sold them myself before anyone could force the issue? What if I converted them to liquid assets and placed that money in trust for Lily's future?" I stared at him. "You would voluntarily give up the properties?" "That is a substantial portion of the estate, Edward. It would reduce your wealth considerably." "But it would secure Lily's future," he said. "If I sell the properties and place the proceeds in trust for her, with you and Mr. Pemberton as trustees, then those funds become hers absolutely. No provision of my father's will can touch them because they would no longer be part of the Blackmore estate. They would be Lily's inheritance, held safely until she reaches her majority. But the will specified that if you acknowledged her, those properties must be sold and given to charity," I said. "Would selling them yourself not trigger the same result?" "Only if I acknowledged her publicly," he said. "The will is very specific on that point. Public acknowledgement. But if I simply choose to liquidate certain assets for my own financial planning, well, that is my right as Duke. And if I then choose to create a trust fund for my ward, that is also my prerogative. As long as I never formally claim Lily as my daughter, the will's provisions cannot be invoked." "It is a loophole," I said slowly, my mind working through the implications. "A dangerous one, but a loophole nonetheless." Edward nodded. "Mr. Pemberton and I have been discussing this possibility for weeks. He believes it would hold up legally as long as we are very careful about how we structure everything. Lily would have financial security. She would have a dowry that would allow her to marry well when the time comes. And she would have the freedom to live her life without fear that everything could be taken away at any moment." "But you would be sacrificing so much," I said. "Those properties have been in your family for generations." "And what good are they?" Edward asked. "If keeping them means Lily remains vulnerable, if protecting them means I can never truly be a father to my daughter? I would rather be poor and have her safe than wealthy and live in constant fear." I took his hand and raised it to my lips, overcome with love for this man who had transformed so completely from the cold stranger I had married. "You are a good father," I said, "and a good man. She is lucky to have you. We are both lucky to have you." "And I am lucky to have you," he said, pulling me closer. "Without you, Eleanor, none of this would have been possible. You saw what I was too afraid to see. You fought when I wanted to surrender. You gave us both the courage to become a real family. We sat there in the firelight, making plans for a future that finally seemed possible. We would sell the properties gradually over the next year, avoiding suspicion by spacing out the transactions. We would establish the trust fund with meticulous legal protection. And we would continue to build the fiction of Lily as my cousin's daughter, a fiction that would eventually be so thoroughly integrated into our lives that it would become almost indistinguishable from truth. But there was one more thing I needed to do, one more piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place for our family to be truly complete. The following week, I asked Edward to arrange for a private meeting with the bishop of the diocese. He looked at me with surprise and some trepidation, wondering what I intended, but he trusted me enough to make the arrangements without demanding explanation. The bishop arrived on a rainy afternoon, a kind-faced man of perhaps 70 who had known Edward since childhood. I received him in the drawing room with both Edward and Lily present, and after the initial pleasantries were exchanged, I came directly to the point. "Your Grace," I said to the bishop, "I wish to inquire about the process of formal adoption, not in the legal sense, as I understand that is complex and rarely granted, but in the spiritual sense. I wish to know if there is a ceremony through which a child who is not born of my body can be consecrated as my daughter before God." The bishop looked surprised but not displeased. He turned his thoughtful gaze to Lily, who sat very still beside me, then back to my face. "You wish to claim this child as your own in the eyes of the Church," he said. "I do," I replied firmly. "Her parents, my cousins, have been delayed abroad, and it is becoming clear that their return may be postponed indefinitely. Lily has lived with us for many months now, and she has become as dear to me as any child of my own blood could be. I wish to formalize what is already true in my heart. I wish her to be my daughter in every way that matters." The bishop was quiet for a long moment, his wise eyes moving between the three of us, seeing I suspected far more than we intended to reveal. "There is such a ceremony," he said finally. "It is not often used, but it exists. A covenant of spiritual parenthood, in which a child is received into a family, not by birth, but by choice and sacred vow. It is not recognized by civil law, but it is recognized by God and by the Church. Is this what you seek?" "Yes," I said, and my voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "That is exactly what I seek." "And you," he said, turning to Edward, "you agree to this covenant. You wish to claim this child as your daughter before God, if not before the law?" "With all my heart," Edward said, his voice rough with feeling. The bishop turned last to Lily. "And you, child," he said gently, "do you wish this? Do you wish to be claimed as daughter by these two people who have given you their home and their hearts?" Lily's answer was barely a whisper, but it was absolute in its certainty. "More than anything in the world," she said. The ceremony took place the following Sunday in the private chapel at Thornfield, with only Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Pemberton as witnesses. It was simple and beautiful and deeply moving, the bishop's words weaving together themes of covenant and choice and the sacred bonds that transcend blood and law. He asked Edward and me to place our hands over Lily's head and to speak vows of protection and love and commitment. He asked Lily to accept us as her parents in the eyes of God. And then he blessed us all, this family formed not by birth, but by will and sacrifice and determined love. When it was done, I looked at Lily and saw tears streaming down her face, tears of joy and relief and belonging. I pulled her into my arms and felt Edward's arms come around both of us. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that we had done the right thing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever compromises we had to make with society and law, this was real. This bond we had forged was as true and strong as any formed by blood. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Richard made no more formal accusations, though he continued to watch us with barely concealed suspicion whenever our paths crossed. But without proof, and with Mr. Thornberry's official dismissal of his inquiry, there was nothing he could do except harbor his resentments and wait for us to make a mistake we never made. The properties were sold gradually over the following year, and the trust fund was established exactly as Edward had envisioned. Lily's financial future was secured, independent of the entailed estate, and protected from any future challenges. She would never be wealthy in the way the Duke's legitimate children would have been, but she would be comfortable, and more importantly, she would be safe. We began introducing Lily more broadly into society, always as my ward, sometimes alluding vaguely to distant family connections that could not be precisely traced. People accepted the story because they had no reason not to, because Lily was charming and well-educated and clearly beloved by the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore. By the time she was 10, she was simply part of the landscape of our lives. Her presence at Thornfield so natural that no one questioned it anymore. And Edward and I, we fell in love. Not the passionate, desperate love he had shared with Catherine, but something deeper and more enduring. We became true partners, true friends, true companions in every sense. The grief he carried for Catherine never entirely disappeared, but it transformed into something softer, a sweet melancholy that coexisted with genuine happiness. He learned to live in the present, rather than being trapped in the past, and I learned that I could be enough for him, that our love did not diminish what he had felt before, but rather completed it. On a spring evening 3 years after that fateful day when I found the ribbon, I sat in the music room listening to Lily play. She was 11 now, and her skill at the pianoforte had grown remarkable. Edward sat beside me, his hand holding mine, and Mrs. Fletcher dozed gently in a chair near the fire. The windows were open to let in the warm breeze, and the scent of roses from the garden drifted through the room. Lily finished her piece and turned to us with a smile that was pure joy, the smile of a child who knows she is loved and safe and exactly where she belongs. "That was beautiful, sweetheart," I said. "Your mother would be so proud." "Both my mothers," Lily said, and the words were spoken with such simple truth that they brought tears to my eyes. "My mother who gave me life, and my mother who gave me everything else." She came to sit between us, this child who had brought purpose and meaning to my existence, who had transformed Edward from a ghost into a living man, who had taught us both that family is something you build rather than something you are simply born into. "Tell me again," she said, as she often did on these quiet evenings. "Tell me about the ribbon." So I told her, for perhaps the 100th time, about finding that small scrap of pink silk in Edward's coat pocket, about how it had unraveled all our secrets and woven us together, about how her birth mother had treasured it, and her birth father had kept it safe, and how it had eventually led us all to this moment, this life, this love. Lily listened with the same rapt attention she always did, even though she knew every word by heart. Then she went to her room and returned with the ribbon, carefully preserved in a small velvet box. She held it gently in her palm, this connection to a past she had never known but would never forget. "I am so lucky," she said softly. "Most people only get one mother, but I have two. One who loved me enough to give me life, and one who loved me enough to give me everything else. I am the luckiest girl in the world." Edward and I exchanged a look over her head, a look that contained everything we had been through, everything we had fought for, everything we had become. He smiled at me, that warm, open smile I had learned to treasure, and I smiled back. We were not a conventional family. We were built on secrets and compromises, on careful lies and strategic omissions. But we were real. We were true. We were bound together by something stronger than blood or law or social convention. We were bound by choice and sacrifice and stubborn, determined love. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The rest was just details, just the negotiations we had to make with a world that could not understand what we had built. But here, in this room, in this moment, with the music still echoing in the air and the roses scenting the breeze and Lily's hand holding that precious ribbon, we were simply and completely a family. The future would bring its own challenges. Lily would grow up and face questions about her parentage, and we would navigate those challenges together. There would be more threats, more people like Richard who suspected the truth, and we would face them with the courage we had learned through this ordeal. Edward and I would grow old together, our love deepening with each passing year, and we would watch Lily become the remarkable woman we already knew she would be. But all of that was yet to come. For now, on this perfect spring evening, we were simply grateful. Grateful for the ribbon that had changed everything. Grateful for the courage to love beyond convention. Grateful for the family we had chosen and fought for and earned. Lily carefully placed the ribbon back in its box and set it aside. Then she nestled between us, one small hand in mine and one in Edward's, and sighed with deep contentment. "Tell me a story," she said. "A happy story." Once upon a time, I began, as I had begun so many stories over the past 3 years. There was a lonely Duchess who lived in a beautiful house that felt like a prison. She thought her life would always be empty and cold, that she would never know real love or purpose or belonging. But then one day she found a ribbon, and that ribbon changed everything. I looked at Edward and he looked at me. And in his eyes I saw reflected all the love and gratitude and wonder that filled my own heart. We had started as strangers bound by duty. We had become partners bound by purpose. And we had ended as lovers bound by choice and family bound by fierce devotion. The old Duke had tried to destroy us with his cruelty, had crafted his revenge with meticulous precision. But he had underestimated the power of love to find solutions where hatred saw only obstacles. He had underestimated the courage of a lonely woman who discovered she was stronger than she knew. He had underestimated the devotion of a father who would sacrifice everything for his child. And he had underestimated the resilience of a little girl who refused to be broken by circumstances beyond her control. We had won, not through deception or luck, but through love and determination and the stubborn refusal to accept a future defined by someone else's hatred. We had built something real and true from the fragments of tragedy and loss. We had created light where there had been only darkness. And as I sat there with my husband on one side and my daughter on the other, surrounded by music and roses and the soft glow of evening light, I understood that this was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of struggle or pain, but the presence of love and purpose and belonging. Not perfection, but wholeness. Not ease, but meaning. The ribbon had brought us together, but it was our choices that had kept us together. Our willingness to fight for what mattered, to sacrifice what was necessary, to love beyond the boundaries society had drawn. And that love, fierce and unconditional and chosen, was worth every risk we had taken, every compromise we had made, every moment of fear we had endured. Outside, the sun was setting over Thornfield's grounds, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Inside, we were warm and safe and together. This family that should not have existed but did. This love that should have been impossible but wasn't. And in my heart, I sent a silent message to Catherine Webb, the woman I had never met but felt I knew intimately. "Your daughter is loved," I told her. "She is safe. She is happy. She knows who her parents were, and she honors your memory. You gave her life at the cost of your own, and I promise you that sacrifice was not in vain. She will grow up knowing love, knowing security, knowing that she matters. This I swear to you, from one mother to another. Rest easy. Your little Lily is home." The ribbon had woven its magic, binding together past and present, loss and redemption, sorrow and joy. And now it rested safely in its velvet box, a symbol of everything we had overcome and everything we had become. But the real magic was not in the ribbon itself. The real magic was in the love it had helped us discover. The love of a father for his daughter, the love of a child for the family that chose her, and the love between a husband and wife who had started as strangers and ended as soulmates. That love was our victory, our vindication, our truth. And no one, not Richard with his suspicions, not the old Duke with his cruel will, not society with its rigid rules, could ever take it away from us. We were a family, unconventional perhaps, built on secrets certainly, but real and true and bound by ties stronger than any recognized by law or custom. And as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, I pulled my family closer and whispered the words that had become our private prayer, our sacred promise to each other. We are home, we are together, we are loved. And that was all we ever needed to be. The end.